Warhammer's getting pretty old. Now, I'm sure that there are people that would beat me for saying that, but if I can read correctly, it first came out in 1983 with the very first iteration of Warhammer Fantasy. That's over 40 years old, not the newest thing on the planet. Disco was only just ending its popularity when this thing came out. The very first edition of Warhammer 40,000, meanwhile, was only a few short years after that, coming out in 1987. Not quite as old, but I've known plenty of family members approaching their 40s. At the hip young age of 26, those people are still old to me, and what is perhaps the most likely to age poorly remark I will ever make. As you might expect of something that came out in the 80s, the original 40k was a bit different to what we have today. It wasn't all grimdark and edgy, though it was a bit grimdark and edgy certainly. It wasn't all Imperium of Man and Space Marines, although those fellas certainly do feature in the game. It was instead a magical place where Leman Russ, by Space Marine standards, was just a guy, the Eldar would frequently be seen walking around the Imperium and no one would complain, and Space Marines were entire armies of buddy cops beating up cyberpunk street thugs in hell. Today, let's go on a journey back to this time of wonders, where if you look hard enough, you can start counting the lawsuits of intellectual property infringement. But before we learn about old Warhammer lore, would you like to know where you can go to learn a whole load of other stuff? Because you can do that at Brilliant, the sponsor of this video. Brilliant is the best place to go to learn math, data science, computer science, and so much more. Among a variety of other things, Brilliant is great for setting and achieving lessons as you go. You start with the foundations, and as the lessons and courses you choose go on, you slowly but surely master the topics of your choosing. It doesn't throw you into the deep end, you can work at your pace and learn over time. And if you live a busy life, don't fret one bit. Brilliant is perfectly usable on PC or phone for as long or as little as you have. Got 3 hours and want to learn all you can at once? Then by all means, fire up Brilliant on your home computer and get learning. But if you've only got a few minutes while you're out of home, that's no problem either. There's no homework to worry about turning in late, no teacher that's going to yell at you for being on your phone in class. Brilliant is perfect on the go or at home for as long or as little as you have. A course that might be interesting to take a look at is programming with Python. Coding's a handy skill to have in an age of computers, and Brilliant has a course ready to help you master it. And as a bit of extra incentive, here's a special offer. Head to brilliant.org/PancreasNoWork/ scan the QR code, or click the link in the description for 20% off their annual plan. That's brilliant.org/PancreasNoWork/ scan the QR code, or click the link below for 20% off their annual plan. You should never stop learning, and with Brilliant, you can learn all the better. Now then, time to kick it old school. Warhammer 40,000 Rogue Trader was released in September of 1987. But while we are going back quite far in time and with a vastly different attitude towards the setting that 40k would become, we can still find ourselves in familiar territory almost immediately. You barely open the book and right away you're hit with the 40k version of Star Wars opening crawl, telling us how the Emperor of Mankind rules 1,000,000 worlds with his inexhaustible armies, and that you should forget the promise of science and technology. You specifically are worth nothing, you're going to die unmourned, and everything everywhere sucks. The more things change, the more they stay the same, I guess. We'll get right into things from here, but if you would like to read Rogue Trader yourself, and it's a free PDF online, so you might as well skim it, be aware that the rules are constantly spaced out with the lore. If you just want the lore from back then, you'll probably find it annoying, but I find it charming, honestly. Yeah, it's a bit of a pain in the ass for reading things nice and concisely, but it's charming. It's from an age where things weren't optimized to hell and back to flood your brain with dopamine, and all the more special for it. Let's start off with the stars of the show, though in Rogue Trader they do have to share the spotlight. I think the best way to start this is to throw some cold water in your face immediately. You know how in 40k AI is considered evil and completely flies in the face of not only the Mechanicus but the Imperium as a whole? Well, to quote Rogue Trader verbatim, robots are a part of everyday life in human and alien society. Most of them are just toys or industrial equipment, stuff to make society go a bit easier and deal with some hard labor humans can't do so well. Some of them are war robots, and it's noted specifically that tech priests are constantly trying to make new and improved versions of said war robots. I think the funniest thing, though, is that Rogue Trader makes explicit mention of robots being capable of discriminating. I'm sure it means that they can differentiate targets and whatnot, but I really like the idea that the first thing people do in making a war robot is to make it racist. They're not just one-off things either. Later on in the book are multiple different rules to field things such as hovering robots or wheeled robots. There's vastly different amounts of profiles and weapons to carry. They all have unique ways of tracking damage, firing, and even moving. Robots aren't just a funny little thing that was quietly brushed away, only being mentioned with things like the Men of Iron the Dark Angels supposedly have stored in a garage somewhere. At the very start of 40k, robots were a common thing to find all across the galaxy. My favorite is the Bombot. You ever see that joke about someone attaching a claymore to a Roomba? It's that. It's just that. The poor things even look like R2-D2 a little bit. With that shock out of the way, let's talk some things about mutants to steady ourselves a little bit. Mutants in Rogue Trader in many ways have a similar situation to how they're treated in 40k, just a little bit less so. In the Age of Strife, emergent psychers on less tolerant worlds, for example, were purged entirely, and this is how mutants are treated in Rogue Trader. On feral and fetal worlds, they're killed at birth, with few exceptions to this rule. On more advanced planets, their treatment does range widely, but overall they can safely be assumed to be a second-class citizens group, even more so than Imperial citizens are already given a shit hand in life. Sometimes they can be treated well, but most often they don't get access to a large amount of society. Mutant groups will frequently revolt, and many of these revolts are successful in the short term, occasionally even getting entire systems under their control, but sooner or later the Imperium puts them down once again. Mention is made that sometimes a mutation isn't obvious, however, and when this happens, a mutant can rise to high prominence. If it's found out, people tend to ignore the open secret if the person is powerful enough. It's still rather horrific in their treatment of mutants, but goes along with the theme of comparing Rogue Trader to nowadays, and that the Imperium tends to be a little bit more tolerant. Also, mutants and Abhumans in Rogue Trader are even more biologically nonsensical. 2 humans having a kid has about a 5% chance of resulting in a mutant. 2 mutants having a kid has a 10% chance of making a completely baseline human being. Indeed, yes, this is how biology works. For another fun fact, mutants in this era are mutants in the same way the X-Men are mutants. There's a list of mutations that you can roll for a character having, and amongst the standard 3 eyes and tentacles affair, there's a mutation that lets you jump across time. You know, simple mutant stuff like that you discuss before going to fight Magneto. Another turns the mutant into a walking head. They have no torso and their arms and legs come directly out of their massive head. How much coke do you think early GW writers were railing on a daily basis? This was all in the 80s, so I have to assume a lot. For some more general stuff, the armaments of the Imperium is far more varied than it is nowadays. Yes, mention is occasionally made of feral worlders using bows and arrows and spears, but nothing nowadays is ever properly done with the concept. The closest nowadays is something like those Attilan Rough Rider models that got refreshed a little while back, but even those guys are using power spears or whatever the hell. In Rogue Trader, a handheld crossbow is not an impossibility. Mention is made of them using some super materials so they don't break, but it's just a handheld crossbow otherwise. Hell, muskets are a usable option on the battlefield. And it's just a musket. It's specifically mentioned as being used on primitive worlds who have heavily regressed in technology. A special mention of one of these primitive worlds is made as well, the world of Birmingham. Birmingham in 40k is a world shrouded in perpetual darkness and whose inhabitants have become culturally and linguistically primitive, and as a result, no one ever wants to go there. Not being a resident of the UK, I can't speak on how true this is, but I can say that's really funny. Very interestingly, however, is the divide of technology across different races, which is to say, it doesn't really exist. Shuriken weapons, for instance, are an Eldar exclusive toy in current 40k. It's them who makes them, and while the occasional Inquisitor, Rogue Trader, or Deathwatch member might get access to some Eldar tech, as a whole, no one but the Eldar is using those things. Back in the day of Rogue Trader, though, this was just another weapon. Anyone could use it, and mention is even made that they use the same technology that things like hover vehicles use. Yeah, the Eldar use them, but so could anyone else as needed. This is then immediately followed by a profile for using a sling as a weapon to chuck grenades, by the way. Because sometimes you have the technology for a grenade, but you don't have the tech for a mortar, so you gotta get creative with hucking explosive death at your enemies. My personal favorite of all the weapon descriptions is the chainsword, though. Maybe I'm just insane, but the chainsword in modern 40k seems to be an almost sacred thing. It's not given as much prominence as the bolter, or more literally sacred weapons like the Emperor's sword, but using one means you're in a position of power most people can't hope to achieve. Space Marines, of course, are the most common users, but Commissars are other frequent wielders of these things, such as Caiaphas Cain himself. Sometimes total nobodies use them, like your Darktide character, but by and large, when I think of a chainsword, I think of someone powerful and up there in the ranks. In Rogue Trader, chainswords are the favorite weapons of pirates. Not the Imperium's finest in one way or another, pirates. Scurvy-ridden people with about 3 biological legs between 5 of them are where you're most likely to find a chainsword wielder at this point in 40k's history. And before I move on from weapons, because there are probably better things to be talking about, I must direct you to look at the screen right now if you're using this video as background noise. You will notice that you're looking at a Colt M1911 pistol. The back-to-back World War champ made it all the way to the 41st millennium, because cultures may come and go, but it'll take more than the Emperor of Mankind and all the threats of the future to destroy the American military-industrial complex. I don't want to tell you what to do, but according to Rogue Trader, investing in Colt is evidently the best thing you can possibly do with your money. A question for you real quick though, if you don't mind. Have you ever looked at a 40k model and thought, wow, that's really stupid? We all have at some point or another, don't lie. Well, introducing to you the first edition era Land Raider. Notice the 2 massive tracks that seem to be about the size of a house each. Take heed of the actual main body of the tank appearing to only be large enough to be piloted by children, in spite of the fact the book says it can fit 10 people in it. And again, with technology not really being unique to people in this era, mention is made of aliens being able to make Land Raiders. But that's child play in terms of how vehicles contrast with modern 40k. Dreadnoughts. Those cool walking coffins armed to the teeth that Space Marines entomb their honored dead in. Those battle brothers too far gone for normal service but still capable of piloting something as a living corpse. They're one of the coolest things in 40k lore, bringing to light the Space Marine monastic culture and how brutal the setting can be. In Rogue Trader, nah, that's just something any old guy can pop in and out of. Yeah, they're still covered in a special amniotic jelly, and yeah, when they get out of the thing, they suffer permanent damage because of how connected they are with the Dreadnought, but there's nothing physically stopping them from getting out beyond that. Dreadnought pilots aren't what's essentially the remains of someone just barely clinging to life, it's just a guy in there. You know Wraith Lords? Well, in Rogue Trader, here's what they are. You can see the words clear as day, Eldar Dreadnought. The big bulbous section in the middle isn't some psychic mumbo-jumbo that stores the Soul Stone or helps them see the world better, it's a cockpit. You can just pop in and out as needed. That also means that yes, Dreadnoughts were not exclusive to Space Marines. They were a type of battle armor available to anyone. Formidable and standing apart, yes, but not some sacred machine to store the honored not quite dead in. That said, they were still powerful, respected pieces of hardware even back then. You know what's a bit less venerable? Whipping a 50-mile-an-hour turn onto the battlefield in your Toyota Corolla. But that's what you could do in Rogue Trader. Rules are specifically given to fight with civilian vehicles on the battlefield, because who cares about things like being acceptably armored or properly armed? You've got a Chevy Sonic with bolters strapped to the side. Into the thick of battle you go. To continue flip-flopping between things that are the same and things that are different, the Imperium even back then was a massive blob of an empire that by all accounts shouldn't exist. Between communication delays from the massive distance or just the fact that space is quite big, traversing the galaxy and maintaining an empire should be impossible. But because of the navigators, it is indeed possible for the Imperium of Man to maintain itself, if only barely. And of course, it journeys across the stars using the warp as a method of interstellar travel. Strange and extraordinary creatures live in the warp, and many of them are quite hostile to those of us from the material world. The Astronomicon lights the warp like a lighthouse, and of course once you reach Terra itself, none other than the God Emperor of Mankind sits upon the Golden Throne, powering the Astronomicon and safeguarding humanity as his body rots around him. Technology is barely understood by most, and in this age of the galaxy the gods are very real, with for instance the blessing of war gods being inscribed on weapons of war. Of note is the fact that these are not gods like Khorne or the Emperor, but unnamed deities the Imperium also prays to. Naturally, Rogue Trader also makes explicit mention of the fact that none of the other beings in the galaxy can match a fraction of mankind's might. Glad that attitude was there from the start, I guess. But this is not the same Emperor of Mankind. The same bones are here, but everything on top is different. In Rogue Trader, the Emperor seems to have just kinda decided to ascend to the Golden Throne. He just sorta did it. There's also zero mention of the imperial truth of the Great Crusade era, or a Great Crusade for that matter. Nothing about the state-mandated atheism exists here. Him being worshipped as a god because he's the greatest psyker is still here, but him being upset about that fact, or indeed even arguing he isn't a god, is absent. In Rogue Trader, he built the Golden Throne, ascended to it, and then accepted that everyone calls him a god, even if he disagrees. Back to similarities now, the various bodies of the Imperium are still the same. The Custodes guard Big E's immobile form, the Adeptus Mechanicus upkeeps the Sacred Machines, the Administratum sucks ass and can't keep anything straight. Once again, the bones of the future editions of 40k are all here, but they aren't fully formed yet. Oh, also, I called it Terra earlier, but no, it's Earth and Rogue Trader. No fake Latin for you, young Warhammer fan. We're going to be almost reasonable with our names here. Perhaps one of the greatest instances of differentiation between these eras is the poster boys of Warhammer, because back then, it wasn't them being the be-all end-all. In this era of Warhammer, the Space Marines were just one of many different forces the Imperium of Man had to throw at their opponents. First off, look at this image. Right now, I want you to look at it, especially if you haven't been watching this video. Really drink it in. Do you know who that is without reading the name at the bottom of the image? Why, that's none other than Leman Russ, one of the premier commanders of the Space Wolves. You heard that right, commanders. Not Primarch, just the Marine who was instrumental in founding the Space Wolves as a chapter. This is how different a time it was, folks. All your silly family drama can get bent. We only have Leman Russ, the chapter master, to look to. Similarities still exist, of course. Marines as they are nowadays weren't magically invented in 4th edition or something like that. Their introductory page, for example, ends with massive text that says, "And they shall know no fear," at the bottom of it. While all of them are savage killers, some of them have different attitudes towards others. Some chapters keep their monasteries so hidden that even the Inquisition doesn't know where they're located. Others are basically open to tourists whenever they feel like showing up. There's still the Imperium's Rapid Strike Force, responding quickly to threats as they approach before the Imperial Army can be mobilized as the anvil to the Marines' hammer. They've got 1,000 chapters of 1,000 Marines each. New recruits are drawn from savage planets for the most part, such as Feral Worlds or Underhives. Their organizations is still entirely separate from the rest of the Imperiums. The boys we know and love nowadays are still very much present this far back. But do you know what they are on a day-to-day basis? Space cops. And before you say, well, that's lame, or you try and dispute me, look at this goddamn picture right now. This is the coolest thing I've ever seen in my life. Bad Boys is blasting across the galaxy as the Emperor's finest descend upon some dude jaywalking to beat his skull in. They even have cool guy sunglasses built into their helmets. Every single Ultramarine in this frame is a loose cannon who doesn't play by the rules, but goddammit, he gets results, so he gets to keep his badge. And if you need further proof, here's this image. The caption for this image is talking about how when the Eye of Terror blinks, the Space Marines descend upon the world shoved back into real space to enact Imperial justice. The Eye of Terror blinking and briefly receding is something that on its own in modern 40k would have radical consequences for almost every faction of the setting, and in here it's just an excuse for the Marines to go beat up people spraying graffiti. Space Marines are equal parts holy warrior monks and riot police, and by God is that fun. Even this early on, they're a separate mystical group of warriors, though in fact, just like nowadays, calling them a singular group is incorrect. But despite all that, they can still be incredibly goofy. You may give us deeply detailed diagrams and explanations of the Space Wolves Fortress Monastery, early GW, but I know what they're doing on a day-to-day basis. They're screaming, "He's reaching!" when an Ogryn walks by on their way to work. For the real main characters of this era, their lore isn't any longer than a lot of the other mentions here. But Rogue Traders are given a rather glamorous depiction here that out of everything has probably stayed the most consistent throughout 40k's lifespan. They're explorers who chart the farthest regions of space, amassing great fortunes and their own fiefdoms as reward for their service to the Imperium. They can come from all walks of life as they climb to greatness, with the book mentioning how one Rogue Trader retired from being a High Lord of Terra to become a space adventurer. But why don't we move on to some new pastures? The Imperium could be discussed for another hour at least, but I think it's time to look outwards in the Milky Way and see what else we have on offer, what other races there are to explore in the wondrous pages of Warhammer 40,000's first edition. Abhumans first, because they're technically still the Imperium. Abhumans have, similarly to Rogue Traders, remain largely the same. They're mutants, yes, but considered stable in their own subspecies of humanity, because they breed no more or less mutations than normal humans do. The Beastmen are here as early as this edition, and Ratlings are called Halflings, but otherwise are still the classic GW version of them, aka seemingly designed by someone who hated Bilbo Baggins on a personal level. Ogryns are still fat and stupid morons, but in this case they don't have the lovable teddy bear personalities they're largely known for in modern 40k. They're just big and dumb. And of course, the Squats. The squats were born here and not long after would die until recently, but in this edition they're the only Abhumans who can regularly climb to positions of power, including the Inquisition of all places. They're short, tough, and in this era they were American biker gang members for reasons we can only guess at. Further lore would develop them into having highly advanced planets in the core worlds the Imperium at large had to play nice with, and then they were out of universe declared to have been eaten entirely by the Tyranids. But it wouldn't be a video I made about 40k if I didn't mention my own favorites, and good lord are the Eldar vastly different to what they would become. We still have craft worlds in this edition, but beyond that they're almost unrecognizable other than still being space elves. For example, said craft worlds are a few tens of miles across. In modern 40k they aren't quite the size of planets, but they're continental at least and are bigger on the inside than the outside. Here, they're big flying saucers where a few thousand Eldar live, tens of thousands at most. They can also freely interbreed with humans, which is most likely because humanity and the Eldar share a common ancestor if you go back far enough. Perhaps even weirder is that not all of them are psychic. They instead have a 75% chance to display psychic powers. Sure, as a species they're sensitive to psychic stuff, but there's a quarter chance that an Eldar isn't a space wizard in Rogue Trader. It stands in stark contrast to modern 40k, where they're all psychers even if for some it's a very minor thing, and becoming something like a Farseer is just a matter of training in the occupation. Obviously it's more spiritual and intense than that, but becoming a Farseer is just taking on the path of the Seer and getting a bit too lost in that career. In this edition of 40k, Eldrad would have a quarter chance of not being Eldrad. You know what else is neat? No Slaanesh influence on their souls, at all. Craft worlds are even described as utopian and idyllic, with nothing threatening them. They don't even have armies. The craft worlds have guns on them and whatnot for defense, but there's no standing military force. All of this is kind of still a thing in 40k with aspect warriors, but in Rogue Trader they ain't got shit for dick of an army. They don't really have much of anything. They go around trading with other people across the galaxy, but even that isn't because they need to, it's just something to pass the time. In this way, they're still more advanced than the Imperium, but they keep to Rogue Trader's theme of no one really having outrageously different stuff to one another. And for that matter, I meant what I said at the beginning. For the most part, when these Eldar show up to the Imperium's territory, it's almost like a festival. People come out to watch the cool aliens sell their stuff and try and see the race of people that's mostly space wizards. They're largely allowed free reign, and if they're offering any services, they're highly sought after. But even this early on, we're still talking about Warhammer. The Eldar aren't all these peaceful traders floating around the galaxy and quietly selling you fancy jewelry. The Eldar most commonly seen in an interesting role are that of mercenaries and pirates. Much like the Eldar trading in this edition, these groups don't do what they do because they have to. Setting the stage for what would become the fall of the Eldar and the birth of Slaanesh later on, some Eldar get bored of the peaceful but dull life on a craft world. They get very bored of it. And so, some Eldar set out in bands to sell their services to anyone who can meet their price. These Eldar are highly sought after by those who needed their services, but they're greatly feared on top of it. They're viciously competent and incredible fighters, but they're mercenaries to the core. Someone offers them a better payment, they'll happily accept the offer, and if they just show up, everyone on the battlefield will worry what's about to happen. Are they there to offer their services to either side and go with whoever pays more? Has one side already claimed them, and the combatants are only going to find out which side that was when the shooting starts? No one knows. Peaceful planets will turn them away, but again, this is still Warhammer. Peaceful planets are few and far between. Even on those planets, you can probably find someone who wants someone else dead. Pirates, meanwhile, are the precursors of the Dark Eldar. They raid for fun and to assuage their boredom of craft world life, and to make a name for themselves, as many Eldar throughout the galaxy do lay claim to some sort of noble title or whatever. You can hire them as mercenaries, but good luck for after their job is done and they decide they want your stuff too, or they decide to take the payment and then shoot you immediately anyways, because who gives a shit? There's no real reason to it, nothing beyond some fun at your expense. They're outcast by their craft world brethren, so you can't hunt them down based on where they live. You can only defend yourself and pray they leave you alone. There are a few more similarities, though. They use warp gates as their primary method of transportation across the galaxy, as their ships and craft worlds don't have FTL travel. This is still using the warp, which in modern 40k is a huge no-no for the Eldar, but it's also clearly a precursor to the webway. They're also an insular and mystic society in the Rogue Trader, very secretive to outsiders. Most Eldar just enjoy craft world life, and the pirates and whatnot are still fairly tight-lipped about what they're doing or where they make their homes. As an aside, the odds of an Eldar carrying a shuriken weapon aren't all that high. Higher than other races, sure, but it's only about a 60% chance as opposed to modern Eldar, which sees entire units only armed with shuriken catapults. They're weird, they're the ancestors of the modern Eldar, and while I do have to admit I prefer modern Eldar over Rogue Trader era Eldar, it would still be cool to see a subsect of them continuing on Rogue Trader traditions. This would ideally be done with Corsairs, but that would mean more Eldar lore, and that isn't happening. Although on that very topic, Uriel's Eldritch Raiders are mentioned here, so once again, the slightest bit of narrative connecting tissue remains. Let's get away from the pointy-eared pansies though, because the boys are here as well. A long time ago, though no one quite knows when, mankind and orc-kind met each other. They took one look at the other and decided they weren't fans of what they saw, so they started beating the snot out of each other. This has continued on ever since, with no signs of stopping. The basic appearance of the orcs as the hunchbacked, tusked, Cro-Magnon skulled fellas was still around even this early on. Them constantly beating each other up for no other reason than to fight was also here, as this orc space not really being one empire, but rather 1,000 different warlords all vying for dominance. They do appear to be rather crueler here, I will say, and much less attention is given to making them appear like silly Cockney football hooligans. It's still kind of there. Rogue Trader does make specific mention of the greenskins often ignoring a commander's orders to wear a proper uniform in favor of the traditional red garb, but at least in the earliest version of 40k, the orcs might be the only things less goofy than their modern counterparts. And one highly intriguing, shall we say, point of contention comes from the Gretchen. Gretchen and Rogue Trader are still the expendable meat shields and laborers of the orcs. That's still here, but there is at least mention of the fact that there are the occasional Gretchen worlds and the even rarer Gretchen Empire. And even more interestingly, mention is made of how due to sharing a common ancestor, similarly to humans and the Eldar, Gretchen and orcs can interbreed. Which combined with the fact that I didn't see any mention of mushroom people means that we're so far back in Warhammer's history that orcs still have lady orcs. And even that isn't the most drastic things with lore changes, because the Slann are around in this edition and still relevant. They're a degenerated remnant of what they once were rather than being the servants of the old ones, and while they are still frog people, you can see that they aren't the fat toads they are nowadays. Also, them being degenerated remnants is a bit of an up in the air sort of thing. They're a cross between the modern day Slann and the modern day old ones, if anything. They used to go around tampering with genetic engineering of countless races across the galaxy, and while it's not explicitly stated, the Jokera's existence could indicate they created the common ancestor of human and Eldar. They're unmatched psychically by even the Eldar, as the old ones were and the Slann are compared to their contemporaries. But them degenerating is explicitly stated as not being some sort of fall from grace or result of massive war or anything like that. In fact, even saying they degenerated from what they once were isn't quite right. Rogue Trader mentions how they seem to have just had a shift in priorities and stopped worrying about being the peerless creators of life and the holders of a matchless empire. Now, they instead seem to watch and listen. Similar to the Eldar of this era, they trade not out of necessity, though in the Slann's case it seems to be because they're watching any buyers for some unknown purpose. Their warriors, called Braves, fight with purpose and seem to accept and even enjoy the idea of dying in battle, but the reasons for that vary from a mystic goal that no one can understand to they just felt like dying in battle today. They're very weird, as is much in this book. Also, since I mentioned them, the Jokero are here. I don't think they've changed at all since 1st edition Warhammer. They were funny monkeys then, they're funny monkeys now. Sometimes you don't need to update a concept, because how can you improve upon perfection? And the last big name faction you recognize as still being around is none other than the Tyranids. Much like the Slann and everything else, they have some things that are recognizable and have largely stayed the same, and other things that are completely off the rails compared to nowadays. They roam space in vast hive fleets that devour entire worlds whole, leaving it as nothing but a barren rock when they leave. All their tech is biological in nature, with specialized beings for different purposes. And they're led by creatures that are always psychic in nature and direct the hive through these powers. But beyond that, they start varying wildly. There's no indication, for instance, that the Tyranids come from outside the galaxy. No one knows how many they are as they travel across the galaxy, but there's no real signs they come from outside the Milky Way. Their biological tech is in part made by forcing other species into becoming said tech, rather than something that just evolved to make. Hive Tyrants still exist, but rather than being leaders on the ground of the Tyranids, they're hermaphroditic beings that give birth to all the Tyranids in a hive fleet and can't move, relaying commands to underling Hive Lords instead. They're said to potentially have millions of craft in each Hive fleet, which holy shit, no wonder Rogue Trader calls them the most dangerous enemy in the galaxy. To paraphrase the book, a war with the Tyranids is a war only the Tyranids can win. And yeah, I think I can see why the Tyranids are coming out on top of that one. They've also got bioengineered slave races that are distinct from the actual Tyranids, such as the Zotes. They're not part of the Hive, but they're kept in line with the secretion that dulls their sense of independence. Sometimes the Zotes form their own empires, and they can become any culture and identity you can think of as they develop. And even more rarely, sometimes individual Tyranids will break away from the Hive and revolt. The Tyranids in this era are still ravenous, still hungry for all life, still a massive threat, but the specifics are so off that they end up looking vastly different. It's like a remake of a movie where basically the only thing that stays the same is the character names. Pop quiz for those of you who are paying attention. What crucial thing in Warhammer as you think of it was missing from Rogue Trader, Warhammer 40k's very beginning? I'll give you a hint, it's the reason for all problems in Warhammer ever, because GW doesn't know how to make interesting origins anymore. That's right, chaos. Chaos is not mentioned a single time in all of Rogue Trader. To be sure, the warp has some dangerous stuff in it. Enslavers debuted here alongside plenty of others, and there's mention made of the echoing laughter of thirsting gods and demons. But the Chaos Gods and chaos in general? Nah mate, that comes from the book Realm of Chaos, Slaves to Darkness. It was published during Rogue Trader's time as the edition of 40k everyone played, but it wasn't there from the beginning. Those thirsting gods weren't chaotic, and in fact with how Rogue Trader has the original 40k title crawl, it's not at all incorrect to assume that at least some of them are prayed to by mankind in addition to Big E. He is, according to the literal first piece of 40k lore ever written, the master of mankind by the will of the gods, and none of them are named Khorne, Nurgle, Tzeentch, or Slaanesh. And on a very related note, there's no Horus Heresy either. Sure, it was briefly mentioned when Adeptus Titanicus was first released, and Slaves to Darkness did flesh it out a bit more with details that have stuck around to this day, such as the Dropside Massacre. But purely looking at the original book, it isn't here. There are no Primarchs, there was no massive conflict that amounted to siblings having a pissing match. There was just Leman Russ and his silly Wat Tambor face mask thing. We didn't even have the Necrons either, not a mention, and this was during a time when robots were everywhere. The closest thing to that was the Chaos Androids, which while they did come out during Rogue Trader's lifespan, they still weren't a part of the original book. And while they're almost certainly the precursors of the Necrons, just look at what a Chaos Android looks like for proof. Chaos Android is about as far from what the Necrons are while still being robotic as you can possibly get. No Tau, no Dark Eldar, no Chaos Space Marines. All of these things and more that would be considered essential to Warhammer's identity just aren't here. And there's endless more strangeness to be found if you look for it. The Imperium in some ways, for example, is more brutal than it is nowadays. Invading a planet held by the Eye of Terror is the kind of thing no one would support, even if it did temporarily recede. Off the top of my head, the only things I can think of that are still canon like that are the Abyssal Crusade and Lukt Huron wanting to invade the Maelstrom. The former was ordered by a follower of Chaos in disguise, and in the latter's case was something that I think Huron was completely out of pocket for wanting done. But in other ways, it's seemingly softer as well. Loss is acceptable, failure is not, is the kind of attitude that flies in the face of the stereotypical attitude of the Imperium nowadays. And I will remind you that it is such a common thing for commissars to execute people that it's a tabletop mechanic, and that's done when they're afraid. Not when they've lost, just become scared. Space Marines get sent on penitent crusades for failure, and the Sisters of Battle oftentimes join the Repentia for perceived shame. But in Rogue Trader, hey man, did you try your best? Well then don't sweat it, hit the gym and come back for another go. There's a fairly large section of the book dedicated to just random animals and wildlife as well. They all have stats and brief lore blurbs telling you what they're all about. This is where we find gene stealers. They weren't Tyranids at this point, they were just a species of alien from a specific moon that had spread throughout space. Them implanting genes and eventually becoming very close to looking totally human is still here, but the book says they're closer to vampires, and yeah, that's an apt description from what's in the pages. Everything is like this. The Dark Age of technology is still here, and in fact it's almost completely unchanged. Even in Rogue Trader, they call it in reality a golden age of technology, only viewed as dark in hindsight by people who treat technology with fear and religious reverence. The rules could be talked about for hours on their own, to hell with the actual lore. Here's a Chaos Lord stat line from current Warhammer. It's got 6 base stats, and the stats for using weapons below. Here is a stat line from Rogue Trader. Look at that absolute brick of a unit datasheet. Now in fairness, this hasn't been trimmed down as much as you might think. While I've heard arguments about strength being weapon specific nowadays, ruining some complexity of the game, it is still around. The same for things like ballistic and weapon skill. And initiative does still show up every now and again, even if not in normal 40k. For example, it's still a stat in the Horus Heresy in the Old World games. But Int, WP, and CL, those stand for intelligence, willpower, and coolness. How cool of a dude you were was a stat in Rogue Trader, everyone. Although in actuality, it's just a model's ability to stay cool under pressure, as it were. Those 3 stats were removed for simplification and rolled into leadership, but in this case, I think that's entirely warranted. As you can see in the image, all 4 of those mental stats are the exact same, and for almost every single unit, this was the case. Moving robots, meanwhile, was a special kind of hell, because why would you make using robots in your science fiction game a fun thing to do? To move them, you had to write down how they were going to move on the next turn in advance. And this scaled inversely with intelligence. The dumber the robot, the more turns you had to write down in advance, with the dumbest robots requiring you to write down how you wanted to move them 3 entire turns in advance. You had to take into account rotating them with this as well, like going turn to 3 o'clock relative to the way they're currently facing. You couldn't just move them as you wrote them down and then turn them around however you wanted. As much as I think robots would be cool to come back more nowadays, and I think it's great the Leagues of Otan now have them, I'm content that that rule is gone. It sounds miserable for everyone but the kind of person to spend most of a Hearts of Iron game min-maxing plane designs. I can't blame GW for moving away from this as a design philosophy, alongside various other clunky mechanics such as hiding your units by not putting them on the board until they're discovered and or do something. Learning Warhammer isn't as hard as many think, but it is a task that requires some effort. All of this stuff adds layers and layers of complexity to the game that I do think go beyond depth and into the realm of tedium. It is still amazing to learn about though, and for the fun of it, I would love to try at least one game with these rules. Who knows, maybe I'd love it. For all I just made fun of those kinds of people, I do love me a good 8-hour Europa Universalis game every now and again. But the most interesting thing to me to look at is how Warhammer 40k itself was viewed, because it isn't a war game, it isn't a role-playing game, it's both. We have point values here, and we have scenarios for armies clashing in epic battles. But there's also an extensive section on running campaigns, which almost immediately mentions how a GM is required to run one and how they should work on creating a plot for the entire experience. Soldiers taking wounds and becoming injured, or even dying between missions, narratives changing based on the outcome of a battle. These are all things that Rogue Trader had and more. You know the massive animal list I mentioned? They have rules for horses, which include informing the GM to look at a vehicle they might be pulling and decide whether or not it's a reasonable assumption that they can pull it. An official Warhammer rulebook is telling you to decide whether or not a model can be played in a certain way based on how you eyeball it. And then immediately afterwards, they mention how only specially trained warhorses can attack, and the GM should think carefully about including such creatures as an option for the players. This isn't what you see in a competitive war game with metas and army win rates. This is the kind of thing you see when you're creating a narrative with friends in your basement with some beer and pretzels to go along with it. And god damn it, it's amazing for that. There's countless more examples of things being described, rules statted out, and then given options for how players might come across them in their games like it's a D&D encounter. This isn't a war game, this is a role-playing game for someone who's willing to keep track of 30 plus different player characters at the same time. So, if you'll forgive me a bit of slightly pretentious rambling, what value does Rogue Trader have nowadays? Well, for one, it's simply fascinating as a historical piece. Looking at Rogue Trader and looking at modern 40k is like looking at movies from the 1910s and movies nowadays. Yeah, you're watching a film, but they're so much different that it's practically a different medium. It's also an endless source of homebrew lore for your armies as well. Sure, the attitudes of factions nowadays are completely different, but the 41st millennium is a big place. There's room for weirdness to be had. If you want your homebrew Space Marine chapter to be warrior monks who beat the snot out of heretical curfew breakers that walk side by side with men of iron, go for it. It may be the oldest possible lore you can find, but there is official Warhammer 40,000 lore that supports that. Beyond that though, it's incredible to see what Warhammer can be. To be clear, the following isn't me saying GW can feel free to break canon however they like because consistency is for nerds. The Dawn of War novels declaring the Eldar prefer to hijack human tanks because they're tougher is something that makes me retch when I think about it. That said, everything in here is Warhammer 40k. Arguably, it's the truest form of Warhammer 40k you can find. This was what 40k was when they made Rogue Trader. This was the product, a janky game in a lot of ways based on the not much more developed at the time Warhammer fantasy battles if it was set in space. So much isn't here, and so much was removed later on. The Emperor himself quietly accepts his divinity, and the Munistorm accepts that it's other gods who wish for this to be. For that matter, no one even knows how the Emperor came about ascending to the Golden Throne except for maybe him. There's no records or memories beyond the fact that it involved a lot of war and ushered in the new age of the Imperium, where technology is scary, people that are different are usually scary but sometimes not, and you might encounter a dinosaur in the middle of a battle because the GM thought it would be funny. But this is still Warhammer 40k, just as much as all the additions following it are. If you ever find yourself wanting to see what the setting was early on, give this book a read. You can find it as a PDF online. All it'll take is time to see what this hobby we enjoy once was. From robots to crotalids to rules for determining how much health a door has, this is where the grim darkness of the 41st millennium began. And despite how much has changed, how unrecognizable it is compared to 10th edition 40 years later, Rogue Trader is, in my humble opinion, still one of the greatest pieces of 40k media ever written. Thank you as always to my wonderful channel members. You are the Warhammer 40,000 Rogue Trader to my Warhammer 40,000, a key part of this channel's blood as it continues on into self-destruction. If you'd like to support the channel, feel free to subscribe or become a member. Either way, thank you for watching and take care out there. This isn't White Dwarf. This is an official GW product telling you how to not buy their models and instead how to make something you can legally play out of a fucking deodorant stick. Old GW was like, cool, man. Now they're just the man.